We're on. Okay.
All right.
So I'm with Fred Liggins, and we're actually sitting in Chicago, a Northern Baptist, but Fred is a pastor, a leader in a congregation in Williamsburg, Virginia.
Yeah.
And Fred, I just want to invite you to say a little bit about what it is that's going on there and your experience there.
Yeah, no. Well, came to serve this congregation 7 years ago. Independent Christian Church Heritage. It was a 150-person congregation with a heart that wanted to change. They had asked themselves the question: if the church were to shut its doors, would the community know that they were absent? Would their absence be missed? And so they were postured for something different, but did what most churches do: reached for program, was wearing themselves out. It's very programmatic and very transactional. Well, to kind of move forward, as my family and we all got there, we began just being together.
How long have you been there?
7 years.
7 years.
7 years, yeah. We developed some new listening practices within the life of the church that started within the eldership and then the folks who work vocationally with the church. Developed some listening practices, led that out into the congregation. We, in the meantime, began walking with a family who was living through homelessness. We walked with them from the streets to a place of housed, and in that journey, they became Christ followers. We did a wedding renewal vow ceremony with them. I have personally worked and walked with friends living in homelessness for 8 years prior to that. Well, word got out into the city, literally into the faith communities and into the city, what was going on in our little congregation. And then a collaborative of 18 faith communities, interfaith, asked me to come and explain to them what was happening. And so in my explanation of what was happening, they asked if I would be willing to help them, through the leadership of our congregation, carry that out into the city in a broader way, to speak to some of the injustices that surrounded that in terms of poverty, because Williamsburg, Virginia is tied to a tourism economy. So there's a certain denial of poverty among us. It has its own narrative. And so we did. We piloted something between faith communities with a family that was beautiful, but that was hurting and that was in desperate need. And a lot of beautiful things blossomed out of that we had no control over. And then when we were done with that pilot, whatever that may mean, other churches wanted to learn how to do it within their own local context. Now, I'm a pastor, and I'm locally rooted in my own congregation. I had no desire to start being a trainer. So my next impulse as a former businessman was launch a nonprofit, right? So I gathered up a lady, a sister in our church who worked very closely in walking with me in relationship with homelessness. And I put together a board of people who understood that we would serve the church and launched this nonprofit that now does this work, right? So now we have 7 local congregations in our particular city doing this work together, which has created a sense of unity among me and other pastors and congregations that I don't think we would have had, especially if you knew our narrative in Stone Campbell. Okay, all of that is going on while we're launching out in missional communities within our own local church. And as we're doing that, word begins to get out that we are the kind of church that welcomes the mentally ill, the intellectually disabled, the addicted, the homeless. So we begin to grow. We begin to grow through our missional communities and neighborhoods. We begin to grow through our large gatherings. And now we are a congregation who probably just under half of our church wasn't in a church 7 years ago. We have blossomed from this predominantly white, older congregation to a multiracial, multi-ethnic, socioeconomically diverse congregation. For example, there was a group home of 25 mentally ill and intellectually disabled men and women who were kicked out of 2 churches. They were literally asked to leave 2 other congregations. Well, the Kenyan Franciscan sisters, Catholics, nuns, heard that we might be a church that would embrace them. Called, and of course, it's not my church, not our church, it's the Lord's church. So they came, and they have been a part of our community for 3 years. As a result of their presence, missional communities have to operate differently at times. Women's retreats now involve things that they never involved before because they need to be included in the life of the community, not just a Sunday gathering. Right? So it's formed who we are as a people. To learn that we can't trick the Spirit into growing a church. That our primary job is to meet around the Eucharistic table every week, to discern the presence of Christ among us, what the Spirit is doing out ahead of us, to remember that we are diverse, and in that journey we are always mutually submitting to one another. We're always moving toward reconciliation. We're never not doing that. And if we ever forget, all we have to do is look at my beloved brother Peter, who is 32 years old with a 7th grade intellectual capacity, who sits at the front with me and stands behind the table of the bread and the wine every week. So the way we practice Eucharist reminds us that reconciliation is never something we stop pursuing and we stop submitting to as the Spirit works among us. And then as that breaks out into our missional communities, that carries on.
So there's a couple of things I want to ask about this. I mean, there's a lot of rich pieces here, a lot of rich strands. And I'm picking up from you that this wasn't the result of some big plan, but it just began to happen as you were listening to the Spirit.
Yeah.
But the other part that I'd love you to reflect upon a little bit, that this was happening because you were deeply rooted in place.
Yes.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Our Sunday conversations, or sermons, if you will, became more interested on what's going on in our city. Our city became a part of our language house. There was a sense of ownership and presence, right? Our neighborhoods. There was a reorientation of place, and there was a redefinition of what home must be. You know, we live in a culture of displacement, so we had to have some sort of means of reorienting ourselves to this place called home. So we were just trying to deeply embed ourselves into a love for our city, and the best way to do that was to try to be listeners, to enter in and be present, to not be judgmental, to not get into the conversations on Facebook and other ways and all the disagreements within our city, but to try and be present in our city, to learn about our city and care about our city. And as people started doing that, bro, things began to change. Sensitivities began to open up. People didn't know there was a 25-person group home. They didn't know that there were Franciscan nuns sent from Kenya 18 years ago to serve them in our own backyard.
Right in the place where
in the place where we live.
Yeah, so it was a discovering.
It was yes.
Yeah.
And we saw God at work.
Yeah.
Miles away from our church building, way out in the boonies where there were 2 group homes. Who now is a part of our own neighborhood that we might call our family life, our community life, right? Our church family. We didn't know they existed. We have Catholic nuns in our church.
But and you're saying the only way you knew that you existed is because you began asking and looking in your own.
Yes, we began asking what is God up to in our city?
Yeah. And
how do we as a gospel-formed people remain present in that city? And then what kind of church does God need us to be based on what he's up to in the city? Does that make sense?
Oh, totally.
Now to do that, we had to be willing to be whatever.
Yeah.
Which means we couldn't figure it out. I'm not smart enough to figure it out. And when we started getting confused and anxious, because I did, the bread and the wine, right, the Eucharist, became a way of reorienting ourselves to the presence of Christ. We were reminded God is up to something.
The freedom to discover and risk and not know was rooted in the fundamental gathering around bread and wine.
Yes, it had to be.
Yeah.
And then our liturgy, when we gathered, inserting time of silence together, where we're just quiet in the presence of God, or corporate readings of Scripture together with one voice. We started finding that we needed a liturgy among us in our larger gatherings adequate enough to settle us down, to help us pull our hands off the wheel and be together.
Fred, there's lots more we want to talk about, but before we end, just one quick thing. You keep using this phrase, and some listening to this might get it, a lot might go, what is he talking about? You keep saying missional communities.
Oh, yeah.
Just very, very briefly, what does that mean for you in your context?
In our context, it means about anywhere between 12 to 20 families who meet in homes and who center their lives upon the neighborhoods in which they all dwell together. And they just simply seek to be present and listen in those places.
So it sounds like that's the crucial core around which your church moves.
It needs to be more of the core. We have our own struggles in terms of equipping leaders to serve in those contexts. But we have about over half of our congregation, large congregation, involved in missional communities.
It's great.
It needs to grow, but so far I'm sure the Lord will lead us in that.
Fred, thank you. Really
Absolutely.
appreciate this. And
Thank
for
you.
our folk in the UK, we just want to let people know that sweet accent comes from the South.
That's right.
God be with you.